Кто никогда не был у нас во дворе ни на одном мероприятии? Так, какое-то количество людей. А для тех, кто у нас уже был, вы, скорее всего, от меня уже слышали этот посыл. Я буквально в 2 словах расскажу вам про институт. Институт «Стрелка» был основан в 2009 году с целью изменения физического и культурного ландшафта российских городов. Для этого у института существуют образовательные и просветительские программы. Наша главная образовательная программа проходит с февраля по весну. Следующий год мы заканчиваем цикл программы, которая называется «Нормал». Программа идет 3 года, ее программным директором является Бенджамин Браттон. Подробнее по поводу этой программы вы можете посмотреть на нашем сайте стрелка.ком. В августе мы начинаем уже прием заявок на следующий учебный год. Также у института существует издательская программа. Наши книги «Стрелка пресс» вы также можете приобрести и заказать на сайте. У нас есть журнал «Стрелка Магазин», который недавно вышел из блога института, который находился раньше на нашем сайте. У них теперь есть отдельный домен стрелкамаг.ком. Заходите, читайте интервью со всеми нашими экспертами. Ну и, собственно, в рамках нашей публичной программы, которая идет до сентября месяца, у нас будут проходить лекции, воркшопы. В этот четверг у нас начинается наш кинофестиваль. Это все вы можете посмотреть на нашем сайте стрелка.ком. Сегодняшнее мероприятие проходит при поддержке Московского урбанистического форума, который сейчас проходит в Зарядье. У МУФа есть фестивальная программа. Вы можете зайти на их сайт, также зарегистрироваться на их мероприятие. Форум будет идти до 22 июля. Также мы сегодня хотим поблагодарить посольство Королевства Нидерландов за то, что они также предоставили нам возможность у себя провести лекцию нашего спикера. У института очень много еще других программ. У нас есть магистерская программа, у нас скоро открывается выставка, которая была сделана в рамках нее. У нас есть еще большое количество других мероприятий, которые мы проводим. И совсем недавно «Стрелка» запустила еще одну образовательную программу для архитекторов. Она вот где-то сзади меня там крутилась. «Архитекторы РФ». Возможно, кто-то из вас про нее читал в новостях, видел на нашем сайте. И я бы хотела сейчас представить руководителя программы «Архитекторы РФ» Артема Герасименко. Артем, спасибо вам большое и хорошего вечера.
Спасибо большое, Даша. Спасибо большое, друзья. Всем привет. Классно вас всех сегодня здесь видеть. И тех, кто впервые, и тех, кто регулярно посещает институт и его мероприятия. Позвольте мне свое краткое выступление на 2 небольшие части разделить. Первое – это то, о чем начала речь Даша, проект «Архитектора РФ», образовательная программа. А второе – это небольшая подводка, интро к, собственно, выступлению нашего основного гостя сегодня. И «Архитектор РФ», как Даша правильно сказала, это образовательная программа, которая запустилась месяц назад на бесплатной основе для всех желающих. Она состоит из 2 больших частей. Это онлайн, модуль онлайн-образования и офлайн образование. Прямо сейчас, сегодня, завтра утром, в ближайшие выходные, каждый может зайти на сайт, зарегистрироваться и начать изучать материалы. Там уже доступен курс про жилье. В ближайшие дни, завтра, станет доступен курс про общественное пространство. В ближайшие 2 недели станут доступны курсы про городскую экономику и городское управление. Дальше будут появляться курсы различных иностранных университетов. Это еще раз доступно каждому в любой момент и абсолютно бесплатно. Тексты, видео, русские субтитры, где это необходимо, и, возможно, сам проверка через специально созданные тесты. Те, кто захочет, интересуется и видит возможность расти, развиваться и сделать нечто большее, из Москвы и в других городах России может подать заявку на офлайн модуль. Там есть такая специальная кнопочка, там все объяснено. Если кратко, то вы нажимаете «Хочу участвовать», прикрепляете документы, портфолио, место работы указываете, объясняете, зачем вам это нужно, почему это интересно, и участвуете в офлайн-программе. Для этого 4 модуля онлайн, про которые я говорил, нужно будет пройти, изучить. Пройти такой один большой тест в конце, где 10-12 августа в этот промежуток. Но это все в рассылках приходит всем зарегистрировавшимся. И, собственно говоря, те, кто пройдет этот тест, 100 человек, которые будут наиболее мотивированы, наиболее заряжены и наиболее полны желания двигаться дальше, смогут участвовать до Нового года, то есть все 4 месяца вы участвуете в оффлайн-образовательной программе, которая тоже состоит из 4 частей. Первое – это 8 дней в Москве в сентябре. Здесь будет конференция «Архитектор будущего», она откроет этот модуль. А следующие 6 дней будет очень глубокая, качественная и многогранная прокачка на тему как личностных навыков. Коммуникация, лидерство, самопрезентация, переговоры, разрешение конфликтов, поиск людей. Многие вещи, которые очень важны для человека, который действует как профессионал и не собирается останавливаться в своем развитии. Также эта программа будет посвящена и развитию профессиональных навыков. И вот может создаться такое ощущение, что программа только для архитекторов, исходя из ее названия. Да, наверняка многие подумали, я не архитектор, я пока не буду это слушать. Так вот, это не только для архитекторов, это для всех тех людей, которые имеют отношение к процессу городского развития. Это и инженеры, технологи, муниципальные служащие, сотрудники, может быть, информационных департаментов, тех ведомств, которые занимаются развитием города, коммунальным хозяйством, жилищной политикой, градостроительной политикой. Вы, может быть, студентом последних курсов, занимающихся профильных факультетов, либо человеком, который занимается этим профессионально больше 2 лет и готов рассказать и показать какие-то проекты, которыми он занимается. Это важно. Это не только для архитекторов, это для всех, кто хочет развиваться как профессионал в теме городского развития и как человек, который живет в современном обществе. Вот, возвращаясь к тем блокам, которые вас ждут в офлайне, если вы попадете в те 100 человек, которые будут продолжать обучение. Первый – Москва в сентябре с 10 по 18. Второй – 5 поездок по регионам, 5 групп едут по регионам России, чтобы посетить и посмотреть все самые интересные места, узнать, что происходит от первого лица, от архитекторов, руководителей проектов, губернаторов, мэров и всех остальных людей. Третий блок – это 8 дней поездка по европейским столицам и осмотр всего происходящего там. И в декабре завершающий, закрепляющий модуль снова в Москве, даже в Подмосковье, с полным погружением и с полным изучением контекста того, что называется выйти на новый уровень собственного развития как профессионал и как личность. Вот, я уверен, что многие желающие захотят. Заходите, архитекторы РФ, регистрируемся, смотрим. Служба поддержки arc@strelka.com, если вдруг вопросы какие-то возникнут. С этим все. Спасибо большое. А теперь я бы хотел перейти к рассказу и к представлению нашего гостя. Флорис, государственный архитектор Королевства Нидерланды с 2015 года. И здесь очень важно то, что на мой взгляд, я вот сейчас дам такой персональный какой-то взгляд на биографию, мы пообщались, обсудили много интересных вещей перед началом этой лекции. И, на мой взгляд, здесь очень интересна траектория, тот профессиональный путь, которым Флорис шел к своей нынешней позиции после долгой совместной работы исследовательской в Гельском университете и в бюро ОМА с Рэмом Колхасом, я думаю, широко известным. Он продолжил свою исследовательскую практику сначала в университете Гента, а затем с 2014 года в университете Амстердама, где основной фокус его работы был поставлен не на новую стройку, строительство, девелопмент, рост города и на какое-то вот пространственное развитие дальше, а на формирование и создание новых слоев восприятия городского пространства, новое осознание и переосознание ценностей, которые имеет городское пространство и отдельные его элементы, и создание этих новых слоев. В частности, слой добавленная социальная стоимость и социальная значимость тех или иных объектов. Я уверен, что он сегодня обо всем подробно расскажет. И в 2014 году, в 2015 году Флорис был выдвинут независимой комиссией, приглашен на пост государственного архитектора Нидерландов, который называют королевским архитектором. Это там одна из интересных деталей. Я здесь передам ему слово и буду рад, если в процессе лекции вы также будете думать о каких-то интересных вопросах, которые можно будет Флорису задать. Отдельно скажу, что те, кто отправится с нами, подадут заявки и отправятся с нами в европейский модуль в ноябре, возможно, увидят Флориса еще раз в Роттердаме, в его офисе, и смогут задать дополнительные вопросы и узнать нечто большее. Пожалуйста, аплодисменты Флорису.
Good evening, and thank you for making me feel so welcome here. It's amazing, this audience. I will give a lecture tonight about how architecture is linked to social issues. I think it's an important domain because it's one of the domains where architecture really can be innovative, where it can become modernized. And so I called it the art of living together. I think that's what architecture in the end is about. And the program we are running, also as a chief government architect, is that of who cares. And of course, who cares has this double meaning, like, okay, who cares? I don't. Versus who is really taking care once questions become complicated, difficult, and linked to social issues. But before I go into that, I want to show you some of my background, because I think the position I take now and the programs we are running, also for the central government, are closely linked to my history I had. In the introduction it was already mentioned, I started my career at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture way back in 1989 with Graham Koolhaas, and I entered the office at a moment that OMA actually hadn't constructed any building yet. It was an amazing moment because the office was famous. We were famous for always winning the second prizes in all competitions, but never the first prize because it was considered to be too impossible. I spent 18 years at the office. When I started there, we had about 30 people. When I left the office in 2008, we had 350 people, so an enormous increase of the office. And for me, very interesting, but I thought in 2008, for me, time was to move on. So I started my own office in 2008, working mostly from Paris. Combining it always with a teaching position, both in Ghent and now in Amsterdam. And as said, in 2015, I was asked to become the chief government architect, which meant a new twist in my work. And I'll explain you how that position is linked to my position as chief government architect and my position at OMA, because I think these two fields, architecture and government and social issues, have to be linked. These are the places I did projects in the world. So working at OMA is working worldwide, and I always have combined architecture with urbanism. So I work in different fields, different domains, different rhythms and projects. And I'll briefly show you as an introduction 3 projects I worked on to give you some idea of the principles of working at these questions. This is when I finished school. Actually, I did my thesis project with Graham Koolhaas. He was a professor at Delft at the moment. And my first project at OMA was Euralille in France. I could work on this project, a high-speed train arriving in the city. I could work on it because I spoke French and because everybody was sure this project would never work whatsoever. Which meant that we have a lot of freedom to experiment. And we thought having no experience at all is an asset. So it was a lot of bluff we put in the game, a lot of joy, playing with infrastructure. And to our big surprise, actually, and nobody actually believed it when we were working on it, the French took us serious. And all of a sudden we were confronted with controlling an enormous building site, having the high-speed train arriving in the city, an entire urban plan and a building next to it. And for me it was a first strong experience what it means actually to be an architect. A project we worked on for about 5 years, fast project, and meeting all these elements. This is an area developed directly next to the old inner city, so it was also about densification and transformation in the urban field. A second project I want to show you out of the list of projects I worked on is this project we did in Germany, in Essen, in the Zollverein. And what me fascinates always is the way that as an architect you're never alone on this world. You're working with many different people involved in the current time and age, but you're also in a dialogue with the earlier generations, because you're always working in a given context. And here I compare it to the position of Shakespeare's Hamlet, who is talking to the spirit of his father. And I think as architects we're often in that position, we're often in a dialogue with the earlier generations, and especially in this case in Essen in Germany it was really there. The buildings were still existing, but the mines had closed down. And what to do with this shape, with this history? And actually the site, the Zollverein, was a beautiful site. Schupp and Kremmer were two architects who designed this industrial plant, and the two of them were trained by Mies van der Rohe. They were students of Mies van der Rohe, so they had a very precise knowledge of how to design beautiful buildings. And they had also the ambition to say that their generation was not building palaces, but they were building industrial complexes. And they said an industrial plant should be as beautiful and as precisely dimensioned as in earlier generations we built palaces. So the work they performed on the Zeche was very beautiful. And of course it was part of this industrial culture that came up in the beginning of the 20th century. Reframing the link between man and machine. Very fascinating to see all these old machineries, these old plants in a site. But in a site that was decaying. I compare it here with a video still from Tarkovsky's movie Stalker. Of all film directors, Tarkovsky by definition is my most favorite one, and his best movie I think is Stalker. And the spirit of the Zollverein I think was identical to that of that movie. This decay, but also this hidden room where all your dreams could be fulfilled. And actually the decaying has also a poetic beauty that was very tempting actually to do nothing on the site. But we had to act, and we choose to respect the building by transforming it. So part of the complex, we said we're going to restore very precisely. We'll make sure that whatever Schupp and Kremmer, their details, their materialization, their architecture, we restore it to perfection. But as soon as we encounter elements that we need to change, we won't hide our own generation. So for instance, all the stairs we had to add, we made them bright orange. Because we said, this is what we add, this is the dialogue, let's not hide what we are doing. I think the best way to respect earlier architectures is by keeping it alive, by giving it a new meaning, and that means transforming it. And that is, I think, a very beautiful game for architects, to work with an existing element and then see what can you do to do the minimum. So where the Uralil project I showed was doing maximum intervention, this project was about minimal interventions. Like on the outside of one of these buildings we transformed in a museum, the only visible sign of the new program is the escalator, 24 meters going directly into the building. Something which is minimal intervention, but yet has the capacity to change the entire meaning of the building. And not only of the building, you become part of a changing culture, a culture totally focused on production, transforming to a culture focused on consumption, a different identity. And somehow we were transforming the building so that it could become part of that transformation. The last project I show from my background is a project I recently finished in Paris. This is the building as we found it. It's a building in 1968, Paris Revolution, 68, May 68, and an architect created this building. It's an insane building. It's 660 meters long. I always tell my students if they come up with such a project not to do it, but the French actually did it. And it's only one detail all the way along, no need to beautify or whatever. The French had organized a competition to see what can we do with this building. And I think I was one of the few entries who made a project not proposing to cut up the building in pieces. Because most architects working on the building tried to normalize it. They said, okay, we can demolish some parts, we keep fragments, and then they become a normal part of the city. But I thought the heritage of 68 in Paris is that madness. And let's accept 660 meters as the human scale. It's just different. And so we made a project respecting this building, a building they actually wanted to demolish, they didn't like it. But we came up with a scheme saying, well, the structure is strong enough to support more floors, so let's simply work with it. And the weird thing is that before we started the project, the people hated the building. And by our project, actually, they also start to appreciate the old architecture of the building. So that's also what architecture can do. So enormous project, we developed it with I think 15 or 16 different architectural offices, a very intense project, and becoming part of Paris. With OMA and with REM, I worked for 18 years, and we discussed often what is the role of architecture. And at one moment we had worked on a project in Los Angeles for Universal Studios for I think almost 2 years, a master plan for the area and the new headquarter building. And then all of a sudden Universal Studios was bought by Vivendi, a French company, and the entire project was cancelled. A project we worked on for 2 years. And Rem got so frustrated by that, by the powerless position of the architect, that he said we need to find a different way to act. And so he came up with the idea to erect AMO. It's the mirrored universum of OMA. And as you can see, the idea was to liberate architectural thinking and to put it in its most pure form to questions of organization and of identity and culture and program. Like how can we act as an architect outside of the domain of architecture alone? So it was a very interesting thing, this think tank to apply architectural thinking. And when I was asked in 2015 to become the chief government architect, I first hesitated because I knew it would kill my office. Yet I thought this would be the perfect chance to do exactly what AMO was trying to do. So I saw this position as chief government architect, the king's architect, as it was used to name, as the perfect model and the perfect position to work within the ambitions of AMO. Because I think this is a position where you're linked not only directly to the king and the queen, but mostly to the central government, where you have a lot of influence exactly on these questions of organization, of culture, identities. So I thought this would be great, and as you can see, it's part of a long tradition. Over 2 centuries, the Dutch nation has a king's architect, a chief government architect. In the beginning they worked with royal palaces only. Now we still work with royal palaces, but next to that you work with all government-owned buildings. So it's a beautiful position where you can have a lot of influence by influencing the debates and by advising the ministers, the central government. Something which can be done in many different ways. And the good thing is you're supposed to address quality, architectural quality, urban qualities, landscape qualities, quality in general. So it's a beautiful position to work in. And usually you're appointed between 3 and 5 years. I gave my time as a chief government architect a motto, basically saying, I borrowed it from Montesquieu, who says, basically, whatever surprises me, interests me. I gave it this motto to reinforce the idea that you really have to have an open mind, no preconceptions, but work with the things that come towards you and which surprises you and how to work with it. So that's my motto. But I also set up an agenda, and in my agenda I listed some points I want to work with. But on number 1 I've put the social agenda. Always, no matter what project you're working on, see what the added social value can be. Because this, when I entered this position, it was in the crisis, a crisis that started 2008, and in the Netherlands, during 5 years of crisis, half of the architects lost their jobs, half of it. And I thought this shows and this proves how vulnerable the position of an architect is. If an architect is linked too much to the developers, to the market. And I thought that the biggest idea behind my time as a chief government architect could be whether we could innovate the entire profession of the architect through social innovations. So for me that was the agenda. There is an office linked to my position which has about 40 people, and we're working on many different projects simultaneously. We have specialists on monuments, specialists in art, urbanists, architects. So a big agenda which already is quite... also working on many real projects. These are the Dutch Parliament buildings in The Hague. In 2 years from now we will close them for 5.5 years for the renovation. So it's real architectural projects. We develop with different other architectural offices. So part of my job is as if I still am a partner at OMA working on many different projects, although my teams are now external architectural offices. But real work, real projects, real world. But I also like to look at cultural elements. Cultural elements that also have to do with national identities and has to do with urbanism. These are 2 images. On the left side Amsterdam, on the right side Moscow, pictured by a Dutch painter actually. And of course the 2 cities are on many domains very different, but nevertheless you can recognize similarities. Somehow in the 18th century there were links, there was a kind of language, although Amsterdam was much denser built at the time. And if I try to summarize the history of architecture in Moscow in a very brutal way, it's maybe these 3 images, at least seen from the Netherlands. I of course know it's much more subtle. But I have to say that seen from the Netherlands, and especially at the architectural schools, this middle time, this constructivist architecture, is something every Dutch architect learns. We appreciate it. We appreciate the creativity and this urge to renew architecture. So if you appreciate Dutch architecture, the roots are also formed by your own history. It's something we very much like and appreciate. But of course, it's not only the architectural style that has evolved, it is also the urbanism. Because if you compare the Netherlands with Moscow, I'm not sure how to trace Moscow, but I tried something here, and I always thought Moscow was a kind of centralized city, but it looks like there's a kind of southern western evolvement now. But looking at the number of inhabitants, as far as I understood, the greater Moscow region is about 16-17 million people. The entire Dutch population is 17 million people. So somehow the history has evolved for the Netherlands and Moscow in a different way. I'm not sure if you know all the Dutch cities like The Hague and Rotterdam, Utrecht. I'm pretty sure you know Amsterdam. And I love Amsterdam, you love Amsterdam, everybody loves Amsterdam. It's a city so beautiful, you cannot love Amsterdam. On the same time, if you look at the way it evolved in the last centuries, there was transformation, there was some additions. But it still is a very small city. Of course, if you look at its identity, it's very strong. I always like the scientific method, so I draw this graph to explain what I mean. If you look at the list, New York, London, Paris, Amsterdam, their identities are similar. But where the other metropolitan areas seem to have a close and direct link between their identity and their size, in Amsterdam it's different. Amsterdam is a really small city. Currently we see how difficult this is if you look at the amount of tourists visiting the city of Amsterdam. The city hardly can take it anymore. So it's a different situation. It's not a metropolitan city like, for instance, London and Paris. And here we mapped 3 metropolitan regions, 3 times 100 by 125 kilometers, and more or less the same number of inhabitants. But as you can see, the Netherlands in the middle has a totally different urban structure. It's an open structure, where Amsterdam is one of many cities. And of course there's a kind of coherence between all these cities. I also added Moscow for the scale comparison. I'm not sure whether it's readable at all, it's the same scale. But of course Moscow has much more to do with centralized metropolitan areas like that of London and Paris. There's a difference in culture. And I think that difference in culture you also clearly can see on the countryside. The Netherlands is a small country, scattered urban pattern. It means that this countryside is not some far away domain where different people live. It's part of what you could call a metropolitan culture as well. So the Dutch countryside is a countryside which is very modern, which has a lot of innovations. The Netherlands, it's a very small country, but worldwide it's the second country when you count exporting food. It's partly linked to the harbour, but the production power of the Dutch farmers and the Dutch food production is enormous. So there's a modernization on the countryside which has a lot of meaning and which brings a lot of wealth, you could say. So this shows how much, what the percentage is of our income that we spend on food in the Netherlands. And I'm sure also Russia, you can see a similar evolution. So the development of the food production is bringing a lot of wealth. And so the countryside is transforming in a radical and a very rapid way. The cities are doing different. And of course, working and living in a kind of consumption-oriented society creates this kind of image. This could be Moscow, you could say. It's a kind of universal language of retail and enjoying and free time. But nevertheless, in the Netherlands, if you look how rich the population is, as chief government architect, I think we have a responsibility to look at what are the real social issues in our country. This is Bertolt Brecht in the 1930s, Berlin, and the Dreigroschen opera, the three-penny opera. And he's saying, but look at it, look at our society, and see how people live. And please do realize that some of us live in the light, and we see those who are living in the light, but also people living in the dark, and we don't see them. And I think for me, as the chief government architect, I want to take responsibility for those in the dark. Like, who are they? What is happening? And of course, we see things happening. If we look at the refugees, in this world, currently we have 68 million refugees. People who are no longer living at their homes, trying to find refugees somewhere else in the world, living in very harsh, difficult conditions, and some coming to the Netherlands. So how do we take care of them? But also if you look at issues like social segregation, in the Netherlands, again, a very wealthy country, if you look at the people from the lower social classes, in average, they have a life expectancy which is 6-7 years shorter than those in the well-to-do culture. So I think that's also something where architects should feel a responsibility to work with. Or other social themes like loneliness. In the Netherlands, we never really took it serious because we thought it was not such a big issue, until we analyzed it and investigated, and we found that 10% of the Dutch adults are feeling very lonely. And again, I think this is something which has to do with our cities, the way we organize our neighborhoods. So again, something where I think as architects we should address that. And I have a strong belief that if you look at the history of architecture, that all important innovations, all the new styles, all the new treatments architects trained themselves to work with are linked to social issues. In the 19th century, about half of the people died of tuberculosis, so there was a big thing. And architects believed, and the people in the medication thought, this had to do with the quality of the air. So modern architecture, with all the light and all the glass, actually had as its agenda to deal with the tuberculosis, to create better cities. So modern architecture is linked to taking care of those who were ill in this case. But also if you look at for instance, the Dutch cities, they have all these signals, these waterways in the inner cities. They're beautiful, they create enormous quality of life in our cities. But they were made in the 19th century in order to attack cholera, the illness. So you can see that urbanism and taking care, again, are linked. And so you have many, many examples. This is Amsterdam in 1900. And the inner cities in the Netherlands were really in bad conditions. And the poor had a difficult time, obviously, there. So in 1901, there was a new legislation to deal and to secure means of create social housing. Again, a kind of social issue linking to renewing and innovating architecture. Like these, this is social housing. So you can see that once architects take that in their agenda, and you can have the best architects, the best practices working on it, we can create beautiful things. Because I think part of what architects can do is rethink the way you construct, rethink the way you address these issues, and also do it in an affordable way, but with an ambition that has a meaning. So in that sense, I think we can learn a lot here from earlier generations, the way they took it serious. Or for instance, this sanatorium, also in the Netherlands, Hilversum, to take care of people with tuberculosis. Beautiful architecture, out of a social agenda. And that's something which was accelerated directly after World War II. These are urban planners, and I think it's very fitting that they are dressed like doctors, and because they were taking it serious, and they were planning reconstruction neighborhoods, and very precisely dimensioned how to take care of the people, how to take care of the healthcare. And the Netherlands has this tradition of social housing for the poor, for the people who cannot afford to buy a house, and it's a very beautiful tradition to work with and to give it a next step. So for this, that was the question. So what does it mean that our society is changing, and what does it mean for our neighborhoods, and how can we work with that? And of course, we have witnessed this change from production to consumption, but we are witnessing other changes that are affecting our daily life in a very profound way. This is a graph showing the screen minutes. The minutes every day we look at a screen, whether it's our television, our iPhone, our iPad, or computer. And in order to understand what it really means, I added the amount of minutes we are awake every day. We are awake about 1,000 minutes a day. And this is the time we spend looking at a screen. And this means something for the way we live. I recently found the number for the Americans. The American average adult looks at a screen 640 minutes a day. And of course, I'm not saying that all this screen time is wasted time. There's a lot of valid information, but it means that our position in the real world is changing. The virtual world is claiming a domain which is ever increasing. And it means also something for our cities, it means something for our society, it means something for the power balance in our way of living. These are the big five. This is where the money goes of all these evolutions. And of course they are doing big business. But it's not just power financially. Currently the Western countries are really worried about certain foreign governments who are trying to influence our elections through these media. Something we really get nervous about, because we do not know how to control what we think, how the information we get is influenced. So it's a new domain where we become more and more vulnerable. And of course it has part of a globalization that is affecting everywhere. In many, many Dutch cities, retail streets are standing empty now because globalization, everybody is doing its shopping via internet. Big changes in the real world through the digital world. This is the Night Watch, the most famous Dutch painting. And look at the school classes visiting the painting. It's a sign of the times. This new media is kidnapping our attention, and I have a rich collection of pictures like this. It's amazing to see this competition between the real world and the screen world, and where the screen world seems to be so easily addictive and changing our culture. Architects, of course, are also part of this virtual world, but I think architects, the responsibility of architects is the real world, and in real time. We have to act in the real world. So I think this is part of what we should be aware of, where we have to work with. This is Pushkin, and I love this quote. I was not born to amuse the Tsars, and I think every time an age brings its own Tsars. And for me, I said, okay, I'm a chief government architect, but I'm not here to amuse the Tsar of finance. I don't think that my role is to optimize financial interests of the Dutch government when it comes to all the real estate the central government owns. So I always stress the fact that when we talk about public buildings, government-owned buildings, that we have to deal with social issues and not only with financial issues when we sell them or transform them. Like for instance this building, this is a prison in Amsterdam. And the last decades in the Netherlands, we have an enormous decline of crime. So we have no longer enough criminals to fill our prisons. And we have to sell many prisons because we simply have no use for them anymore. So this one has to be sold in Amsterdam. And of course, being it in Amsterdam, the property value was enormous. Not of the buildings itself, they were in really poor condition, a lot of asbestos. But we worked with the central government saying, okay, but if you want to sell this property, I think it is better not to go for the highest financial bid. Let's go for the best plan. So instead of simply selling the terrain, there was a kind of competition between developers who had to work with architects and had to come up with a plan. So before they even could do a financial bid, they had to show what they wanted to do in this area. And we set a number of criteria to evaluate all the different ideas. And we managed to convince the government that the financial bid would only weigh for 50%. And for 50%, the quality of the initiative they wanted to initiate on the terrain. So in the end, we were able to sell the property, not to the highest bid, but to a lower bid, but with a better plan. And actually, plan working with sustainability. 98% of the building materials are reused in the new project. It's really amazing. Energy neutral buildings. And on the same time, very public-oriented cultural functions integrated in their commercial operation. So you can add a lot of quality to your cities if you ask the right questions. But next to that, I thought it would be important not to work only with government-owned buildings, but actually to address social issues in the community of architects. So since I became the chief government architect, every year I try to organize a major competition. A competition in order to address these issues. First year it was a home away from home, on refugee housing. Who cares? Second year, and now we're running bread and games in the countryside. A home away from home was based on how do we deal with refugees in the Netherlands. This is what we usually see happening. We have an influx of refugees, and normally you cannot predict how much people will come at what moment. So it's always trying to address it in a rapid way. But I think this is not the correct way to receive refugees in your society. Because if you put people in houses like this, in temporary houses, they are in a ghetto. They are not becoming part of your society. They have a real hard time to integrate. And everybody in the cities hate these buildings. They say they should go as fast as possible. So we organized a competition and we said, let's rethink cheap housing, flexible housing, and not only for refugees, but for everybody who has a limited budget. Because we think our cities need that dynamic of people that come and go, whether they're expats or refugees or people who are just divorced, whatever. If you do not have money and you need a flexible home, we should provide that in our cities. So we organized a competition for it, and we said it may be flexible, it may be temporarily, but let's not compromise on quality. This is an example I sometimes use to explain what I mean. This is Martin Margiela. It's a fashion designer. This is a collection he made during the crisis. Because he was told, you're a fashion designer, now it's a crisis, so you have to come up with clothes that's how much cheaper. It's a crisis. So he came up with this collection. He said, okay, only make half the clothes, half the price. But I'm not going to compromise on the quality of my design. I'm not compromising the quality of what I believe in. And of course, for the fashion, depending who wears it, it's not a great idea maybe, but I think for architects this is the concept to work with. Do not compromise architectural qualities in times of crisis, or when things are getting difficult, or when budgets are limited. Always go for the real thing, for the real quality, and find other ways to limit your budget, simply by being smarter or more radical. Take decisions that are innovative and that are different. So that's how we organized the competition. A lot of teams entered the competition, and we forced the teams to hand in only 3A3 paper. So we didn't want everybody to develop entire plans, simple schemes. We selected 6, and we made real size prototypes from them, simply to test what can we do. And they are more expensive than these container dwellings I showed you. But they are only more expensive if you look at 5-year lifespan, which is the normal lifespan of a container dwelling. But the prototypes we developed, they can easily take 30, maybe 40 years of a lifespan. And if you take that lifespan, then all of a sudden constructing houses like this is much cheaper. And like the one on the right, you can pile up 6 stories high, so they can be very urban as a prototype. And something we like to work with in our cities. Something we can do, and this is also what design power can do. Rethink these concepts and make flexible homes that have a different meaning for the urban context they're in. We also had some weird ideas, like this guy made a house out of polystyrene only, a kind of nesting system where he could build up out of one piece of foam an entire house. Very interesting. Maybe not for the Netherlands, but we thought this could be interesting for instance, refugee camps. Cheap, we can produce it locally, and being out of polystyrene, it isolates perfectly against cold and heat, and everybody can finish his own home, cut windows wherever he wants. And part of that program we were exporting. For instance, I had the privilege of being able to present our approach at the United Nations in New York at a conference, exporting the importance of good design qualities also when it's about a refugee crisis. We're also having a program that we are running together with Lebanon. They have a population of 4.5 million inhabitants, and they have a refugee influx of about 1.8 million people. So it's unbelievable what this country is facing. So we are talking together with organizations from the Netherlands, with the people in Lebanon, to see, can we work with you? Can we improve conditions in your refugee camps? Can design actually make a difference? Something we're testing in many different ways, and then again something where I think architects can play a role. Who cares? Was a second competition, and that was something which was related to these issues of healthcare, of the elderly in the Netherlands, of loneliness. And here again we organized a competition, but a competition where we said this is a competition where it's not allowed for architects to enter alone. This was a competition opened alone for architects who would team up with caregiving people working in the healthcare. So architects forced to work together with people from the healthcare. And we, of course, want to link it to the way we build our neighborhoods, the way we build our cities. Our generation builds more than all the combined earlier generations together. And of course we see a lot of new towns all around in the world, and like this article in The Guardian explains, somehow they all start to look alike. And for us, especially in the Netherlands, we have a strategy that we say, okay, we need again to build a lot of new houses, but let's no longer consume open space. It's a small country, we do not have that much open space. So we say, let's build the new houses in the existing neighborhoods. Let's densify them, let's transform them. And we think transforming the existing neighborhoods can improve these neighborhoods. And if you look at the current urbanism in the Netherlands, it's all about mixing programs. I think the 20th century about separating functions like working, living, teaching, healthcare. The current approach in the Netherlands is let's bring these elements, these programs back together. Let's create cities where it's all about mixing and integrating different programs. Another major element in our strategies nowadays is sustainability. There's a new legislation now in the Netherlands that new built houses no longer will have a connection to gas as an energy. Until this time, everybody had, by definition, the right to be connected to the gas supply. It's no longer the case. New built houses have to be energy neutral. Something which is renewing our neighborhoods, renewing our techniques, renewing our architecture in a very profound way. And it's a very important agenda if you look at issues like climate change. And if you look at the current urban practice, this is just a random example in the Netherlands, it's all about these themes. How can we reintegrate nature in our cities? How can we densify them and at the same time transform existing tissues? How can we make sure that people no longer need to be in the car all the time? So we densify around the public transport nodes, focus on bike roads. In the Netherlands it's all about the bikes, of course, but it's a very efficient transport means. But yet I think it's not enough. I think we need to add this social agenda. And this is a quote by Simone de Beauvoir, the French writer. And she says, if you want to know what the real value, the real quality of a society is, simply look at the way they deal with the most vulnerable people, because that will show the real face of the society. And I think she's very right in that. And that's also why we made that the subject of our competition, Who Cares? Who cares for those who are vulnerable and have to live in our cities in difficult conditions? And this, of course, is related to the aging population. This is a graph showing how the situation in the Netherlands is evolving. We had an enormous amount of young people being born after the war. We have an enormous amount of people going old now. It's an aging society, so we have to prepare ourselves. We have to prepare our neighborhoods for that. So this competition, we contacted 4 cities in the Netherlands, and we said, okay, but what are your most problematic neighborhoods? What are the neighborhoods that you really need to transform? And we set up a collaboration with these cities. So the architects, together with the people from the healthcare in their teams, they could work on real life situations, on real projects. And again, a lot of people entered, and it was very interesting to see how different architects are going to think when they have to team up with people who are taking care for elderly people, or with people who are working in hospitals or doctors. They have other insights of what our society needs. And I think if we talk about innovating the profession of architecture, it's all about connecting it to other domains of knowledge. And that's what this competition showed. other insights by combining a very complex question of how to renew our neighborhoods with a very complex question of how to renew the way we take care of people. So for every city we selected several projects. Sometimes they're almost amateuristic. Again, people were only allowed to hand in 3 A3s. Sometimes these health take care giving people are not so trained in presenting their plans. But we selected for each city 5 schemes where we said, well, there's a potential, and those teams got a budget to develop their plans. And sometimes it's a minimal intervention, sometimes it's a grant intervention, and testing how we could renew our neighborhoods. These plans have been developed, and again we have choose for each city a winning scheme and a runner-up, and then when a runner-up. And these projects now have to be realized. So every city, every 4 cities, made a commitment to do their uttermost best to actually realize these projects. And they're not only interesting in its architecture, they're interesting in their program. This, for instance, is a neighborhood in Almere, one of our new towns. This is a project where generations are mixed. So this is a neighborhood where old people will live together with young people. Kind of mix where people can help each other. A similar approach, but in a completely different context in the city of Groningen. Beautiful neighborhood. A lot of old people for who their houses are become too big, too difficult. They can no longer climb the chairs. And at the same time there's a huge student population. So this is a project, very smart, minimal interventions, but by doing that, separating the dwellings into 2 dwellings, one for the student, one for the elderly. And simply mixing generations is already a very powerful tool to work with in our society. The south of Rotterdam, again a completely different neighborhood, a very harsh neighborhood, difficult architecture, and this is a project with a much more radical approach, renewing an entire neighborhood by putting whatever has to do with caregiving, not on the edge of the city, but right in the middle, creating a new center with it. And we selected the second project, which is very subtle. It's very long rows of houses. And what they do, they cut new streets in the existing tissue. And in these new streets, they make very precise new typologies for the elderly people, so that they no longer have to leave their neighborhood when they no longer can live in their own houses. In the south of Holland, another project where they say we can create communities of about 10 houses where people share a lot of things. So as you can see, we selected different projects, different strategies. For us it's an experiment to see, okay, what works, and then we can scale it to a bigger dimension for the other cities in the Netherlands. I think that's how we should work as architects, as planners, as people in the government. That we have to realize that we have to live in our own time and age. And it's of course always easy to look back in times, especially in the elements you appreciate in earlier generations, and think, well, life was so much easier. But there is no way back, there's only a way forward, and we have to work with it. And we have not the luxury that we can be disappointed in our own time and age. We have to work with it. It's our responsibility, and we can do it. And I think that is what architects need to do. This is the work of a Dutch artist who worked for 50 years on one project, a utopian vision of our cities. I think that in the end is also part of the job of an architect. Work on utopian visions. Think about the future, not as something as an imminent loss, but think about the future of, okay, what can we do with all the technologies, with all the wealth, with all the social issues we have? How can we create better cities, better neighborhoods? I think that is in the end a responsibility for our profession. I think it's a beautiful one. apart from that, I think it's not necessarily that it means that we are going to do everything different. It's not how things work. It's something which demands for precision. It demands for good design thinking. And my last slide is this one, a reference to a Japanese technique to repair broken ceramics. And I think the beauty here is that they're not trying to repair it in an invisible way, but they repair it with gold. Because they say the fact that it's broken is part of its history, it's part of its beauty. I think this is how we need to work in our cities. It's not about changing everything, it's not about erasing everything. It's about the fact that our generation adds something with precision which changes the entire context in a way that it improves the quality. And we see that happening in our neighborhoods. A lot of things are malfunctioning. They're no longer doing what they are intended to do. But we can work with it, and that is what architecture makes worth living for. Thank you.
Спасибо, Флорис. И теперь у нас есть несколько минут на ваши вопросы. Можно задавать их на русском, только сначала, пожалуйста, представьтесь. Девушки в зале с микрофонами помогут вам. Пожалуйста.
Флорис, спасибо за вдохновляющую лекцию. Я архитектор, трижды главный архитектор города. Первый раз в Ульяновске. Вот, там же главный архитектор области, и вот недавно главный архитектор был я в Пущино. У меня есть некоторый опыт работы в этом смысле с территорией и с сообществами. Я бы хотел сказать несколько слов о моем представлении о том, как организована работа в Нидерландах, как мне кажется. Значит, вы сказали, что у вас 40 человек в офисе. Значит, правильно я понимаю, что это не только архитекторы, но еще и другие специалисты?
That's correct. Some of them are urbanists, some are advising on art. The Dutch government, whenever they make a public building, 1% of the budget goes to art. So there's a lot of art advisors. Advisors on monuments, different disciplines.
Thank you very much. И следующий вопрос. Вот смотрите, то есть получается, что у нас, например, в нашей стране главный архитектор города или региона, он не имеет такого офиса. Он выполняет только административную функцию. То есть это подписывает бумаги. Значит, в этом смысле меня это очень заинтересовало. Я сейчас сразу же в Фейсбуке об этом написал, что это, вообще-то говоря, трагедия для нашей страны, что у нас это все так. Значит, что нужно сделать в нашей стране, чтобы поправить эту ситуацию? Значит, это отдельный разговор. Значит, я благодарен вам, что вы рассказали об этой истории. Вообще же во Франции тоже 300 лет уже, если не 400, где есть главный архитектор Франции, то есть королевский архитектор Франции, начиная с того, как была создана Академия архитектуры Дуарт, он в течение нескольких столетий был главным архитектором. Я не знаю, как сейчас. Поэтому для нас этот опыт, он вообще фантастический. Спасибо.
У нас еще вопрос.
Maybe if I can, you had one question about how to fix the situation in Moscow. I'm not trying to mix in the Russian politics, but I think it's important that you have an advisor that can advise independently from politics and independently from financial considerations, just focusing on qualities. And that is, I think, what makes the position special. And maybe it's possible in a Russian context too.
Спасибо за вопросы. Еще один вопрос.
Один вопрос.
Меня зовут Коткин Андрей, руководитель поиска «Стройсила». Скажите, пожалуйста, вопрос такой о наболевшем, о реновации. Как вы думаете, в Москве, а Москва это пример для всех российских городов в последующем, прозвучали такие фразы у вас, что нельзя стирать под ноль, старики должны оставаться жить в том же доме, в том же месте. Все-таки что, как вы думаете, произойдет у нас? Будет ли альтернатива, я имею в виду реконструкция, потому что ведь много домов советской эпохи, кирпичные, крупноблочные, которые имеют большой потенциал временной. И в ваших примерах, и на примере дублюца, мы видим склеенные вещи, интеграция, сохранение городской ткани. Все-таки что у нас происходит и произойдет, как вы считаете? Да, и вдобавок хочу сказать, что еще деревья, которые существуют в жилых районах сейчас, липы, дубы, им более 50-60 лет. То есть это очень такая серьезная биосреда, которая формировалась несколько десятилетий. Спасибо.
Спасибо за хороший вопрос.
Yeah. Indeed, and I think it's two questions in one. And of course, the old trees, keep them, make them part of the neighborhoods you are developing. And of course, I cannot tell you what will happen in Moscow or in Russia, but I know that some of the old housing complexes are in very poor condition, if you look at the construction. So it's always a question, can you maintain them or not? I think the beginning question should be, how should people live in these neighborhoods? What can we do to improve their conditions? And sometimes part of this architecture you can maintain. There's a lot of new techniques coming up, and if the structure is right, you can rework the structure. And it's all about having programs where you put architects in a position they can work with these questions. Because in the end, the creativity and the quality architects can have to design new structures. And I think reworking the existing tissue in the end is something which demands more creativity, more collaboration, more consulting local inhabitants. It makes everything more complex. But the good thing is then once you come up with answers, these answers are not the problems for other people. They are then addressing the interests of many people. And I think also looking at Moscow, it's so beautiful to see all the different languages, architectural and politically, that this city is superimposing. And I do not know of any country with a history so violent, so rich, and so multi-layered as that of Russia. And I think the city should reflect that. So don't erase layers in your city that are part of your history. Work with it and ask architects to come up with solutions. And I'm sure these old neighborhoods need to be transformed. But I'm sure no matter how poor the conditions is, people are attached to it. So consult them, see what the qualities are, work with it. And but then in the end, sometimes, of course, you have also to demolish. It's not that you can keep all buildings for all time. That is how cities work. Every generation takes something away, adds something, and that's what's making cities interesting, and now in the end our lives less boring.
Спасибо. И вот у нас еще был один вопрос.
Управление недвижимостью. У меня вопрос. Прокомментируйте ситуацию в Амстердаме. Почему возникла такая острая нехватка жилья? Почему ваши предшественники не предусмотрели рост города и возникшую потребность в жилье? Почему молодые специалисты живут в коммуналках?
Спасибо.
Well, the Amsterdam situation is a different one. If you look at the Dutch situation, Amsterdam is a city growing, but it's growing because there's a lot of expats coming to Amsterdam. And at the moment, the prices for the residential houses are skyrocketing, and they're kicking out local residents because they simply can no longer afford to live there. And this is a question that as a chief government architect I'm not addressing directly. It's this local government who has to work with it. But there I think the good thing is, like I showed, is the open urban structure of the Netherlands. So Amsterdam is suffering from it, but we have many other cities that are flourishing now. And in that sense, the centralized metropolitan regions like Moscow, but London and Paris too, the city centers become so expensive that they are getting paralyzed. They no longer can move. And the good thing is that the dynamics you can have in parts that are not in these centers is much richer. And that's something I think Moscow could also learn from cities like London, where you have the development zones, which are no longer in the center, but on the outskirts, that you create new sub-centers, so that you don't force everybody all the time to go to one gravity point only, where all the problems are extrapolating. So housing market is a difficult one, because at the moment, especially in Amsterdam, but I guess it's also in Russia, the people buying the most expensive houses are not the people living here.
Спасибо. По желанию можно продолжить потом дискуссию в частном порядке, если недолго. Вот у нас там был вопрос, уже очень давно молодой человек хотел задать. Секунду. Нет, не вы.
I wanted to ask, my name is Andrei, and I wanted to ask, how do you find the perfect balance between renewing the city and keeping the history of it? Because, as you said, you need to keep the history, but you still need to progress.
It's a good question, and there's no one answer to it. It's always about the local context. So whenever, in whatever situation you work, you have to be aware of the context and study it and analyze it and talk to the people living there and talk to the local governments and then add creativity to it. Don't simply repeat what's happening all the time, but find new ways. And there again, like I mentioned in my lecture and stressed it, the social issues are usually the best and the most powerful tool for renewal. And that will help you to balance qualities, balance also the way you want to evolve in the future. And in the end, it's as much the social questions as it is about architectural ingenuity. Good design power helps to find that balance. So there's not one answer other than good thinking, a lot of energy, and look at the context spatially, but also socially and politically.
Спасибо. И, пожалуй, последний вопрос, молодой человек.
Hello. This is the continuation of the previous question, actually. Can you say the same thing, just repeat it, concerning the Moscow constructivist architecture? Because, well, what many see here, that the Moscow restoration movement, they consider this as something to be either demolished or reconstructed piece to piece. Nothing in between. And the question here, one more question connected to it, the influence of the Western Europe by the constructivists, could it have some reasonable way back to Moscow? Do you people living in the Western Europe have any right or link to the Moscow constructivist architecture? Not only local people, but because it is the basis of your architecture as well.
Thank you for this question. And yesterday I have been visiting the Melnikov house, and it's unbelievably beautiful and a kind of example. And that would be an example where I would advise try to restore it very precisely. But at the same time, I think it's not necessary and it's not the right approach to say that for all these buildings, all these projects. I think the constructivist period was a very rich one because it was experimental, it was testing things. And I think often, like I showed in the beginning with this project in Germany, but in the end became a World Heritage Project, nevertheless we modified it. Sometimes the best way to show your respect is by transforming it. And don't declare these buildings sacred in one given shape. Because in a way that sometimes means a death penalty. Because then the building can no longer adapt, can no longer change. And then often budgets won't be able to correct such an approach. So add elements of change, add elements of your own generations. And you can do that in a respectful way. And I think Rancoas, like the garage project shows it. You can be radical, you can change things and still be respectful. You have to find that balance. And I think a legislation which condemns buildings to one possible outcome only looking backwards, is not the right approach. That's also why I used Hamlet in the beginning. It's not a monologue of his dead father, it's the dialogue. And I think that's the way we have to treat our heritage. Take elements, change things in order to respect it, and also to give it a second life. Don't create dead monuments. Make them part of your current time and age. Whether Western Europe has something to say in that, I don't know. Like I said, in the Netherlands, but I'm sure in many Western countries, it's the construct period of architecture that is recognized as something which has so much power of renewal, of ideologies, of smart architecture. That definitely is something, the knowledge, the culture, the exhibitions, it's something you can export and see if you can set up collaborations maybe with other institutes. Currently for the Melnikov House, there's also a Dutch heritage organization advising now on how to restore elements. So set up these collaborations, because the more people recognize the value, the more possibilities you have to maintain them.
Thank you, Floris. Thank you for the amazing lecture and revealing answers. Спасибо всем большое, что пришли. Если у вас есть какие-то вопросы, можно в частном порядке.
Спасибо.
И, пожалуйста, следите за следующими событиями на сайте стрелка.com. Всем хорошего вечера.